If you've been here, we've been talking about how the resurrection of Jesus was the turn, this moment in history when the world was heading one direction towards evil, sin, and death. It was being ellipsed or collapsing into chaos. And out of those moments, Jesus comes and he is crucified. This moment, this dark day when it seems as if the one hope for the world is gone. But then on that Sunday morning for Easter, he is raised from the dead. And at that moment, we've been talking about how that was the turn, the moment when the world made a shift from darkness to light. And what this means is that we are living in a new world. We're living in a new world with a new king. And a new kingdom is coming. And this new world has new rules. Or old rules applied in new ways. So one of the big questions that comes out of this way of thinking about this new world is, what inspires your life? So what is it that gives you a drive? Or what leads you? What is it that you are going after? Because these questions in this new world are going to shape how you live and what you ultimately care about the most. So the old world has tons of answers for these questions. So I just happened to hear a commercial yesterday, and when I say that, I mean I was watching YouTube. I was watching a video about the Colts, the press conference with the head coach and the GM after they had their first round draft pick. And in the middle of that, there was a YouTube ad. So it was about sports because I'm watching something about sports, and this is what the YouTube ad basically said. It says, if you have a passion and you follow that passion wherever it takes you, you'll be right where you want to be. So that's a message that ad is telling you. It's basically encouraging you to, and I don't know what they were selling, I wasn't watching that closely, but they're trying to tell you, like, look, if you care about this enough, this is what you should put your life towards. And if you did that, you're right where you want to be at the end. But there's a lot of people, I'm sure you could ask, who would feel differently. In the Major League Baseball, there's 30 Major League teams. I could be wrong. I have 32 in my brain, but that's 32 NFL teams. With these Major League Baseball teams, they all have 3 or 4 levels of minor league teams. And a lot of those players will never make the big leagues. They're only there to fill the rosters. They all have hope. There are career minor leaguers who don't make very much money. Some of them try for years to make the big leagues. You think that some of those guys, whenever they're in their early to mid-30s, they're still not in the big leagues and they're getting ready to get cut? I mean, now maybe they have a way of making sense of it. But do you think they can honestly look at their life and say, you know what? I'm right where I wanted to be when I followed my dream. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't follow their dreams, but we have to realize that not always is that the best advice. This is just one way the world tries to lie to us. It tries to offer us an answer to this question of, well, what is it leads us? What drives us? What is it that we aspire to be? Now, the new world has a new rule, or it has a remade rule packaged in a new way. And that's that in the new world, Jesus leads the way. In the new world, Jesus leads the way. And this is what we get to look at today as we look at John chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. So if you're going to turn to John chapter 10 today in your Pew Bible, or if you want to look on the screen, or if you have a Bible you've brought, John chapter 10, verse 1 through 10. It starts on page 1527 in the Pew Bible. But let's take a look at this, because in the new world, Jesus leads the way. And this is how this starts. It's not working, Emerson. So why don't you just change it for me? Okay, very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. You can leave there on that slide. So this is how this passage opens. Now we're joining this gospel in the middle of a conversation. And if you were here during Lent, we actually looked at the broader story. The biggest rule when we read the Bible is we have to make sure we read passages in context. We have to see how one passage connects to another. So in this specific story, we heard the passage that this was a part of. If you remember a couple weeks back before Easter, we had the story about the man who was born blind, and his disciples, Jesus' disciples, asked Jesus, well, why was this man born blind? Whose fault was it? And their assumption was that it was because of the sin of his parents. And then Jesus says, no, it wasn't that. And Jesus heals the man, but it was the Sabbath. And he healed the man by making some dirt on the ground or something. I know he did something that was viewed as work by the disciples or by the religious leaders. So Jesus heals this man, and then the religious leaders get upset with Jesus. And then Jesus and this man have this conversation because he gets kicked out of the synagogue, and Jesus asks him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the guy's not sure who it is, so Jesus says, I am the Son of Man. I am the Messiah. And then the man says, yes, I believe. And then the Pharisees and the religious leaders have this argument with Jesus. And it's within that story, that argument, that this comes up. And the question that gets asked is, or what Jesus says to the Pharisees is, he says, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. So in some way, this parable is connected to this conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees about this man who they've just kicked out of the synagogue because they believed that he was a follower or a disciple of Jesus. So let's see how it continues. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. So Jesus continues, and then now he says, okay, so I've told you about those who climb in the pen, but now the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd. So what Jesus is doing is he's taking the thieves and robbers and the shepherd, and he's putting them against each other. So as we read this story in this parable, we have to think about who these characters are and how they relate to each other. So verse 3, let's continue. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, the shepherd, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. So again, this is more about the shepherd, because Jesus says, the sheep aren't going to follow a stranger, but they will follow the shepherd. And not only that, but the person who keeps the pen, the gatekeeper, he's going to recognize the shepherd, and he's going to open the door for him. And whenever he calls to the sheep, they will recognize his voice, and they will go with him. Now remember, in the ancient culture, what shepherds did is they protected the sheep, but they also led them to pastures. So they would just go into the countryside and try to find places where they could graze and eat. And they would also take them to water. And most importantly, they'd also protecting them from predators. I mean, humans that maybe want to steal them, but also predators who would be trying to get a nice little sheep snack for dinner. So the shepherd is super important for the sheep, and the sheep know their shepherd. But verse 5, but they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. But the sheep do not know a stranger, or they do not know the stranger, so they will not follow him. I don't have a lot of experience taking care of animals, but the animals I do have, I know that they recognize they're humans, and they're sometimes nervous of people they don't recognize. That's just standard. This is how you survive in a world of lots of threats, kind of instinct for animals. They're not going to trust a human that they don't know. So the sheep are the same way. They're not going to just trust anybody. But now the big question for all of us comes down to, well, what does this parable have to do with Jesus? What does it have to do with resurrection and new life and the turn and a new world? Well, this is what's going on. With this parable, we need to understand that for the Jewish people, now remember, Jesus is telling this parable first to Pharisees and his disciples. They're all Jews. They know their scriptures well. In the Hebrew scriptures, shepherds were often associated with God. God was the shepherd of Israel. He would make sure that Israel was taken care of. As we just heard, Psalm 23, David has this whole psalm about how he's being led as a sheep by God. But not only in the Hebrew scriptures is God associated with shepherds, also the leaders that God places over Israel. So kings and priests and religious leaders, they all have a role to play in Israel's life as shepherds. But specifically, they lead Israel on behalf of God or in place of God. Now, if you've ever heard of the term vicar, it's an old school term for a pastor. We don't really use it here. It's more of a UK English term. But that vicar is short for vicarious. Someone who leads in place of somebody else. Pastors lead vicariously in place of Jesus. And that's what the religious leaders were supposed to do. And that's what the king was ultimately supposed to do for Israel. He was supposed to be the first one to lead the way in following the law. But if you read the Hebrew scriptures, there was a lot of conversation in the prophets about bad pastors, or not pastors, bad shepherds. The word pastor also comes from shepherd. So I'm throwing myself for a loop. Bad shepherds. So now what Jesus is doing is he's saying to these religious leaders, okay, we're in this scenario. We all know you're supposed to be the shepherds. But maybe you're the thieves climbing in the pen to steal the sheep away. Because remember, what just happened? One of their sheep, one of their own people, they kicked out of the synagogue because they did not believe that he was faithful to them, because they had already rejected Jesus. They rejected the one they were supposed to be leading people to and showing them how to follow God, who's come to be with his people. And so Jesus says to these Pharisees and these religious leaders, maybe, just maybe, that you are the thieves and the robbers, because I am the true shepherd and my sheep know my voice. Now, when we're reading John here in a moment, they're not going to get it. But this is what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. So in keeping with the football theme, I said earlier that I was watching a video about the draft. The pick that they were talking about, if you didn't hear, is that the Indianapolis Colts have a new quarterback in town. So in the first round this last week of the draft, they drafted a quarterback at spot 4. So this is going to be a good quarterback, hopefully. But anyway, what does the quarterback do in football? The quarterback's responsibility is to lead the offense and specifically to know every single player on the field's responsibility. The quarterback needs to know all of their responsibilities. They need to know all of the blocking assignments. They need to be able to read the defense and make sure that the line is blocking correctly. They need to make changes to the play if the play isn't right. So they have to know where every person is going in that play. They have to know all the routes that anybody might be running. And they have to be able to make changes. They are the shepherd of the offense. And that's what Jesus is saying. He says, I am the shepherd, the one who comes to lead my people. So this is the claim that Jesus makes. He's the one that's come to lead the way. So we step back one step and we think about that ad that I heard this week. What kind of ads, what kind of advertisements, what kind of messages are we hearing in the world that are trying to pull us a certain direction? And this is what we have to ask ourselves. In this new world where the turn has happened, who are we following? We all have a shepherd. There's this quote that I love. It's about spiritual formation. Spiritual formation is just this concept that you are being formed into something spiritually. And that quote says, look, we all are being formed. The question is Jesus forming us, or is it somebody else? And if we just don't care, well, then that's the decision. Or if we don't think about it, that's the answer. We're being formed by whatever's in front of us. We have to ask ourselves, who is it that leads us? Is it a political leader? Is it a political party? Is it a sports franchise? For some of the younger people in our midst and in your lives, is it influencers and YouTube personalities or musicians? For some people, it could be a religious leader who's more important than Jesus himself. Who is it that we're following? As we make our way through this new post-resurrection world, there's only one person who ought to lead us, and that person is Jesus. In the new world, Jesus leads the way. But the Pharisees didn't get that. Look here in verse 6. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. So they didn't understand, so Jesus said, okay, I'll give you another example. So verse 7, he says, therefore, Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. So now he changes his story or his parable. He goes from a shepherd to a gate. Now the gate keeps the sheep safe in the pen. The pen could be, if they were out in a pasture, they could have had a place where there was a walled off area where they would go at night. But also people would live in these communities where maybe they'd have sort of everything would be fenced in. And they would bring the animals into the courtyard at night or into the houses if it was really cold. But they would bring them into the courtyard to keep them safe at nights from predators. And so they would have these gates. And the predators would enter, or the sheep would enter through the gate and they would enter into safety. So now Jesus says, I am the gate. I am the one who has come to make these sheep safe. He says, but those who have come before me are actually thieves and robbers. So a challenge again to the Pharisees. He continues in verse 9. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. So he's talking again about himself. And now he says again, I'm the gate. And he says, those who come through me will actually be saved. This idea that he comes to bring rescue to his people. So he's going to save them. Now we need to remember that this is all in the context of that conversation about the man who was kicked out of the synagogue. Jesus says, you've rejected him, but I've received him. Those who enter through me actually find salvation. And so what Jesus says to those religious leaders, he's actually, you are thieves and robbers. You are leading my people away from me, but I've come to save them. Verse 10. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Jesus comes that we might have life. But the others come to lead us, and where they ultimately lead us to is destruction. In the new world, Jesus leads the way. Not only is he Savior and Lord, but he's King. And as King, he says, follow me and I will show you a life worth living. I will show you true life. I will bring you into life. Again, the world offers lies. But what we must do is discern the truth. And sometimes these lies take religious forms. It becomes so hard. But the claim of John and Jesus through John is that Jesus leads us on the way of life. So in this new world with new rules, the rules are we going to follow Jesus or are we not? And when we follow Jesus, we should be formed into his image. We should be made more into his likeness. We live the way of Jesus, and the way of Jesus creates us into a certain type of person. And then we share the good news with others. In the new world, Jesus leads the way. So in this new world, we have to ask ourselves, who are we following? What are we following? What is shaping us? What is making us into the people we're being made into? And if it's not Jesus, well, we have some changes to make. Because Jesus says, I alone have salvation for those who enter through me. He says, come in through me. I am the gate, and also I am the shepherd. And what he says next, which we don't read, is he has the parable that we've all heard where he says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd's waiting to lead us. In the new world, Jesus leads the way. As we make that turn into the new world, will we follow Jesus?